and introduce our distinguished speaker. Dr. Cara Rogers-Stevens is an associate professor of history at Ashland University, where just this week, she was also awarded tenure. She has a master's degree in history from the University of Texas at Dallas and a PhD from Rice University. Her research has been published by the Journal of Southern History and American Political Thought. She was the winner of the APSA's 2022 prize for Best Article in American Political Thought. And her first book, Thomas Jefferson and the Fight Against Slavery, was published by Kansas University Press in January. And if you notice here, we have some copies available for purchase. At the end of her talk, at the end of the Q&A, I think Josh Distel, yes, you're going to handle this. So if you're interested in purchasing a copy, they're $30. Unfortunately, we only take cash, I'm told, but those copies will be available for you to purchase at the conclusion of this talk. Just a few words about the book itself. This book could not be more timely. Everyone in America ought to read this book because, and I really believe this, I think this book can save our country. And I'm not just saying that because I'm married to the author. Ladies and gentlemen, I am so proud to introduce my wife, Dr. Cara Rogers-Stevens. Ekesli for yo.
Well, hello. Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I am so glad that I finally get to talk to all of you, the people that I care the most about the things I have been studying and thinking about for a really long time now. So this is going to be a lot of fun for me. So as most of you know, I teach American history here, but I'm not originally from America. Sometimes, as those of you who studied with me know, in classes where we're talking about the concept of American citizenship or national identity, I like to ask the question, how do you define someone's nationality? Or to put it another way, how do you know that a German is a German? And then you usually say something like, well, the person speaks German, or they're from the land of Germany, their ancestors are from there, they have history there, they like certain kinds of food, they like beer, that makes them German. But America is unique. It's the first nation in the history of the world formed not primarily because of the ties of blood and soil, but rather because of attachment to certain ideas. And therefore, being an American doesn't have to do with where you're born, or your language, or your religion, or your culture, or food. And that is why I am just as much an American as anyone else here. The certain ideas that form the backbone of American identity, I think we would all agree, can be traced back to the Declaration of Independence. As long as I can remember thinking about myself as an American, the ideas of the Declaration and the stories of the Founding Fathers have been important to me. Particularly when I was your age, and I was trying to figure out who I was, the way that I found a sense of self as an immigrant was through studying and identifying with the founders. They were men who lived more than 200 years ago, but they seemed to throw open a door to me and tell me that I, too, could come to America as a sort of refugee from the nation of my birth and find a new life and a new purpose, a new sense of belonging here in this nation of immigrants. Lately, though, I and many other Americans have come to question the founding ideas and the men who wrote them. More and more, we have become concerned that those founders were actually deeply problematic. Did they actually have an egalitarian vision for the future of their nation? Or was it exclusionary, with limits on who got rights and who did not? This particular question really resonates with me because of where I'm from. My first country, bless you, was a totalitarian regime that was based on the idea that all men are not created equal, a regime absolutely obsessed with keeping people divided and unfree. I was born in South Africa. It's right down at the bottom of the map, just to help you out there. I spent my first few years living under a system of government called apartheid. How many of you were here for Naomi Tutu's talk earlier in the week? So you're already somewhat familiar with this topic. In order to understand apartheid, you have to first understand the difference between ethnicity and race, and then you have to know a little bit about the history of South Africa. So here we go. There are many different ethnic groups in Africa. Some of those groups include the Zulu, the Tswana, the Xhosa. Your ethnic group is linked to location. Differences in appearance between one ethnic group and another are the result of how your ancestors evolved over time in connection with the geographic place where they lived. So members of ethnic groups can look different from members of other ethnic groups, and ethnic groups are also genetically distinct. A DNA test can tell you your ethnicity. A Zulu person is a member of an ethnic group with a shared ancestry and a long history of living in a particular location. Irish is an ethnicity. Sioux is an ethnicity. Chinese is an ethnicity. But when someone uses the word race, they're not meaning the human variations that are genetically observable through a DNA test. Instead, they mean they've divided human beings into several large groups, or races, based on visually observable characteristics, groups like white or black or Asian. These are not scientific categories. There is no scientific definition for the white race. Membership in that group depends on where you're living, what period you're living in, and who has political power at that particular moment. In South Africa, the majority of the people were and are members of African ethnic groups. The government called these people black. Then there are the minorities. There's the one that the government labeled white, and these people are either fairly recent English immigrants or they're Afrikaans. I'm actually both. Dad's one, mom's the other. Afrikaans people are descendants of migrants who came to the very bottom of Africa in the 1600s, from Europe, Western Africa, Madagascar, Indonesia. They developed a language called Afrikaans, which sounds like Dutch, but it has a few other words from all of those other cultures thrown in. Now, something interesting happened along the way. The members of this Afrikaans group, whose skin tone is light, were labeled white, but those whose skin tone is darker came to be called colored. So now there are three distinct racial groups living in South Africa: the black people, who could be members of any one of a dozen different ethnic tribes, each with their own distinguished language and culture; the white people, who could be English or Afrikaans or the descendants of some other European immigrant; and the colored people, many of whom had the same ancestors as the white Afrikaans people and spoke the same language as the white Afrikaans people. Because their skin is darker, they were and still are sometimes considered a different racial group. Make sense? And we're not done yet. Shortly after World War II, a small white Afrikaans group gained power, and they set up a racial policy called apartheid. This translates to apartness, and that's a great name, because the white Afrikaans minority government was excellent at keeping the South African people apart. A centralized state used terror and the law to keep people separated, divided, and disunified. The government employed misinformation, censorship, and violence to keep the system in place for almost 50 years, between 1948 and 1994, when we finally got a new constitution and democratic government. Apartheid economically ruined the whole country, because it kept a majority of the population in ignorance and poverty. And it harmed the morals of the whole country, because it was a system based on a fundamental lie, the lie that all men are not created equal. Let me give you an example of how stupid and irrational that lie is in practice. So under apartheid, just about every part of your life was defined and limited based on your skin color. You had to live in a specific neighborhood, go to a specific school, only befriend and marry people in the same racial group as you, unless you were Japanese. The government had a special exception for Japanese. Instead of having to live with other people classified Asian or being part of a subgroup of colored, Japanese people were labeled honorary whites, and they were allowed to live in white neighborhoods and interact more freely with the ruling class. This was because of a trade agreement. South Africa needed Japanese goodwill for the money, and so sometimes money speaks louder than racism. This exception to the rules was particularly offensive to another group, the Chinese. As one Chinese businessman put it, quote, "If anything, we are whiter in appearance than our Japanese friends." Other South Africans pointed out that when they were policing beaches or swimming pools, and they were trying to figure out who was allowed in and who wasn't, it would be pretty tricky to tell apart the Japanese people and the Chinese people. But the policy persisted because racism is illogical and stupid and ultimately more about power than about facts. I was lucky in several ways. I was born in Cape Town, which is a city that was a lot more free than the rest of the country. I had friends who weren't white, and my parents lived in an illegal neighborhood where people kind of broke that segregation policy. They decided to leave partly because of the economic barriers in our country, partly because of the increasing violence, and partly because America offered us freedom. Freedom to live where we wanted, to go to the schools we wanted, to read the books we wanted, to befriend people no matter their skin color. I have treasured these freedoms in America. And because I know what it's like to live in a country based on inequality, my favorite political document is the Declaration of Independence. I love that document, as you might know if you've ever taken a class with me. I marvel that it was written, that at this one specific moment in the long history of human beings oppressing one another, a group of dudes in Philadelphia decided to put into their merely revolutionary document an abstract truth, applicable to all men at all times, as a rebuke and a stumbling block to tyranny and oppression, to paraphrase Abraham Lincoln. On the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, for a lot of Americans, it's become increasingly harder to look back at that group of dudes in Philadelphia without asking some hard questions. Like, how could Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration, have also owned slaves? This was the question on my mind when I got to graduate school, and it's the question I've spent the last 10 years trying to answer. So for the remainder of my time today, I want to talk about Thomas Jefferson, and specifically share my research into Jefferson's views on freedom, race, and slavery. I believe these are important topics worthy of our consideration, not just because they're part of American history, but also because the way we as a society remember Jefferson has a tendency to affect our culture, our politics, and even the way that we feel about ourselves as Americans. And that brings me to another important question. Why is our collective memory of Thomas Jefferson so important to Americans? In 1874, a biographer named James Parton said, "If Jefferson was wrong, America is wrong. If America is right, Jefferson was right." And that's still how many people feel today. So I will conclude by speaking briefly about the reasons we have for this emphasis on Thomas Jefferson. But first, Jefferson's views on freedom, race, and slavery. When we think about Thomas Jefferson, the first word that comes to our mind should be freedom, because he's one of the Americans who did the most for the cause of freedom, not only here, but around the world. After all, Jefferson wrote those wonderful words in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And he also wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which begins, "Whereas Almighty God hath created the mind free." This document, to my knowledge, is the first one in the history of the Western civilization to guarantee the citizens of a state the right to believe and practice any religion or no religion at all. And its ideas were enshrined in the First Amendment, which still protects our religious freedom to this day. Jefferson was not, at first glance, the type of guy you would expect to have radical ideas about freedom. In fact, Jefferson was born into power. When he was 14 years old, his dad died, and Jefferson inherited land and several dozen enslaved human beings. At the time, that was normal. The landholding class in Virginia controlled the power, and they passed it down father to son, father to son. But Jefferson came to support revolutionary policies that gave the vote to poor men, not just rich, and he helped undercut the elite class's power over the land. He also advocated for free public education and for college scholarships so that the ruling class would be composed of the brightest and most virtuous people, not just the richest. Whenever he saw that political reform was possible, he pushed for that reform to take place, even if it meant hurting his own financial future or his status. So now the big question, you're probably all thinking, what about Jefferson reforming slavery? Surely he could have done more about that. Well, the record shows that during his early years, there we go, as a lawyer and a revolutionary leader and a diplomat, Jefferson was openly and unabashedly opposed to slavery, and he opposed it in several ways. As a young lawyer, he took on 6 freedom suits pro bono for free. And he tried to get his clients' freedom by arguing, quote, "Under the law of nature, all men are born free, and everyone comes into the world with a right to his own person." Unfortunately, this case bombed in front of the judges, and he failed. When he was a young legislator in 1769, Jefferson co-sponsored an anti-slavery bill. The bill made most other members of the legislature furious, and it failed. Over the next few years, he wrote a constitution for Virginia that would have ended slavery in Virginia after the year 1800. His constitution was not chosen. His Declaration of Independence is, of course, the best example of Jefferson's commitment to the idea of natural rights. One part of this document that most Americans don't know about is the deleted paragraph that deals with slavery. Hopefully all of you have had a chance to read that by now. So you'll know that in that first draft of the Declaration, Jefferson accused King George of violating the sacred rights of Africans. He called them a distant people who had never offended the king. They were captivated and carried into slavery in another hemisphere, or they incurred what Jefferson called miserable death on the voyage over. Jefferson very carefully used the word men in all capital letters to describe these human beings whose rights were being violated. This is surprising to a lot of people because we all know in 1776, the guys with the power were the white males. And so a lot of people assume all men are created equal just applied to white males. But Jefferson very clearly intended that word to mean mankind. Since the enslaved people who were being bought and sold in slave markets weren't white males, they were black men, black women, black children. As a side note, never once in all of his years of writing did Jefferson ever acknowledge a right to enslave other human beings. He only ever described it as a legalized injustice. He never described it in positive terms, only negative. A few years after he wrote the Declaration, Jefferson drafted the Northwest Ordinance of 1784, laying out the principles for how federal territories should be governed. And he included a line that would have banned slavery in any federal territory after 1800. This provision was defeated by how many votes? We remember who got sick that day, what state he was from? New Jersey, right? The guy from New Jersey didn't show up for the vote. The proviso was defeated. Jefferson commented on this by saying, "Thus we see the fate of millions unborn hanging on the tongue of one man, and heaven was silent in that awful moment. But it is to be hoped it will not always be silent, and that the friends to the rights of human nature will in the end prevail." When he was president, Jefferson urged Congress to end the slave trade at the earliest moment allowed by the Constitution. Just like he had in his first version of the Declaration, Jefferson called the slave trade violations of human rights. And fortunately, enough members of Congress agreed that America actually did ban the slave trade in 1808. You might be thinking to yourself right about now, okay, fine, but what about Jefferson's personal actions? Didn't he own slaves himself? Yeah, he inherited 52 enslaved human beings when he was 14 years old, and he inherited 135 more through his marriage. He bought approximately 20 people in his life, and he sold many, sometimes to make money, sometimes in order to reunite enslaved people with their family members. And although Jefferson freed 5 people in his will, he didn't free them all the way George Washington did. Legally, Jefferson could not have freed all of his slaves in his will, even if he wanted to. When he died, he was deeply in debt, and the law therefore prohibited him from freeing slaves. So Jefferson opposed slavery, but he didn't free his slaves, and he wrote all men are created equal, but as we are going to see, Jefferson also held racially prejudiced views toward Africans. Jefferson is a paradox. Is Jefferson also a hypocrite? One possible way to answer that question, I have found, is to ask, how did the young abolitionists who knew Jefferson personally deal with this seeming inconsistency in his life? Did his apparent hypocrisy bother them? William Short is a great example of one such younger man. He was a distant relative and neighbor of Jefferson's who got so close to Jefferson, he called Jefferson his adoptive father, and Jefferson called him his adoptive son. Historians have ignored Short. He's pretty boring on the surface, except that he was America's first career diplomat. His letters are long and agonizing to read, and he has really bad handwriting. So we ignored him until Annette Gordon-Reed found a letter that he wrote. She found this in the 1990s. It's this old letter from 1798. And he wrote it 2 years before Jefferson was elected president. And Jefferson, at that time, is running for president. Short is over in Spain. He's a diplomat. He wrote to Jefferson to say, oh my gosh, I've just heard some rumors. Some people have gone over to Africa, they've done some exploring, and they think they found a massive city, bigger than London, in the heart of Africa. That would be a game changer. If Africans didn't just live in tiny little primitive villages, if they were civilized enough or sophisticated enough to have big cities, maybe Americans could overcome their prejudice toward Africans and could imagine a future of a multiracial republic. Short said, once enslaved people in America were freed, the best thing that they should do would just be to marry the white people. In fact, Short said marriage between the races would be much better than, quote, keeping 700,000 people and their descendants in perpetual slavery, or freeing them, but keeping them, quote, separated from the rest of the community by a marked and impassable line. Short's attitude toward racial intermarriage was way ahead of its time. In fact, Virginia didn't allow white and black people to get married legally until the Supreme Court forced them to in 1967. Ever since this letter was highlighted by Annette Gordon-Reed, a few scholars have started to look a little bit more closely at William Short. And what we've found is you can actually learn a lot about Thomas Jefferson by reading about William Short. Far from simply being Jefferson's friend and secretary for a few years, it now seems William Short was Thomas Jefferson's conscience when it came to the issue of slavery. He was the person that Jefferson spoke the most openly to about the most controversial issues of their time. The reason that these two men were able to have such a long, more than 40 years of letters and open conversation, I think is because they spent some time together in Europe in the 1780s. For 5 years, Jefferson was America's ambassador to France, and William Short was his secretary. And during this time in France, Jefferson was able to talk more freely about race and slavery than he ever would be again. He was far away from living in the pressures of Virginia's plantation society, surrounded by all those liberal Enlightenment philosophers, and he was really hopeful that he was about to be out of debt, and therefore he'd be able to do something about emancipating his own slaves. Jefferson dreamed about a white, or a Virginia that wasn't just white, rather, a Virginia that was free from slavery, and he spoke openly to William Short about his ideas. Now, there's another reason why this particular time in Jefferson's life is really important, and it's because while he was in Paris, he published his book, Notes on the State of Virginia. In this book, Jefferson presented one of his strongest arguments against slavery. Here's what he said: owning other people would inevitably make Virginian masters into tyrants, bless you, and the Virginians' children would also be, quote, nursed, educated, and daily exercised in tyranny. And even if somehow slavery didn't corrupt the white population and destroy their society from within, Jefferson had an even more dire warning that a violent slave revolt was inevitable. I tremble for my country, he said, when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Jefferson predicted that one day, inevitably, when the slaves rebelled, God would be on their side. However, in addition to these eloquent anti-slavery passages, Jefferson's book included several sections where he summarized and commented on theories about race that had been made popular by European scientists. As many of you know, in the late 1700s, Europeans and Americans typically believed the white race was the most civilized and that other races, especially Africans, were inferior. They disagreed, however, on whether or not that inferiority was permanent. And they also were not sure whether blackness itself was permanent. Some philosophers, like Voltaire, argued God created the black race separately from the white race, and therefore any inferiority was innate and probably permanent. Other scholars, like the French naturalist Buffon, argued that skin color had to do with climate. Blackness could be lightened, so if a person from Africa moved to Sweden for a few years, their children or grandchildren could be born with white skin. Still other Enlightenment-era thinkers, like Benjamin Rush, the American founding father, thought that dark skin was the result of an illness like leprosy, so maybe it could be cured. Jefferson was in the camp that suspected racial differences were permanent, and he therefore wrote any interracial marriage would be degrading to the white race. Enslaved people should be freed, he said. They were innately endowed with equal natural rights, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness by their creator. However, since they were possibly racially inferior and definitely racially different, Jefferson also argued in his book that after slaves were freed, they should be colonized to a different location where they could govern themselves separately. One of the most interesting things I learned while I was doing the research for this book is that Jefferson actually changed the section on race quite drastically after he got some editing advice from this man, Charles Thompson. He was an Irish immigrant, really cool founding father. You should look at his Wikipedia after this. He was an intellectual, scientist, secretary for the Continental Congress. Jefferson sent the manuscript to Charles Thompson and asked for his feedback. And Thompson wrote back a little comment on that section on race. He said, "Though I am much pleased with the dissertation on the difference between the whites and blacks, and am inclined to think the latter a race lower in the scale of being, yet for that very reason, and because such an opinion might seem to justify slavery, I should be inclined to leave it out." In other words, I agree with you on the whole race thing, Mr. Jefferson, but just in case somebody misunderstands you and thinks that you're pro-slavery, maybe you should delete that. Well, Jefferson didn't delete that, but he did soften it. He changed the wording to make it clear that he did not know for certain whether or not racial differences were permanent. He had, quote, a suspicion only about racial inferiority, and he therefore said further scientific study was necessary. Now today, we Americans find this section of Jefferson's book one of the most disturbing things written by a founding father. But when he wrote them, they were far less controversial. In fact, he was repeating fairly commonly held beliefs and scientific theories. Moreover, individuals in the late 1700s had no conception of how different races could coexist in a republic. Was a multiracial republic even possible? No one had tried it before. So advocating for colonizing freed people wasn't controversial. What was controversial was advocating to end slavery. Jefferson said slavery corrupted Virginian society. It was immoral, it was unjust. It had to end, hopefully peacefully, but if there was violence, God would not be on the side of the white people. When Jefferson printed his book in 1785, he had reason to believe that more and more people were sympathetic to abolition in Virginia, because that was already happening in the northern states. Vermont was the first to end slavery in 1777. The rest of the northern states would all pass anti-slavery laws over the next few years. In Virginia, there were petitions from Christian groups like Quakers and Methodists to end slavery, but their success was short-lived. By 1806, Virginia's tide had turned and they were putting more restrictive laws against emancipation in place. But for this brief window of time in the 1780s, while Jefferson and Short were together in Paris, it looked like freedom was possible. And that's when Jefferson started to dream. He wrote to several friends that he wanted to take advantage of what was going on in Virginia, the softening of public opinion, by sending copies of his book from France, particularly to college students like you. He wanted to aim at the College of William and Mary, where the future leaders of Virginia were being brought up in the principles of liberty. And he said to one of his French friends, "It is to them I look, to the rising generation, and not to the one now in power for these great reformations, for ending slavery." William Short was exactly the type of man that Jefferson would have been thinking about when he dreamed of reform. Like Jefferson, Short seems to have gotten his anti-slavery views while he was a student at the College of William and Mary. Short's father died. I had a granola bar right before I started speaking, and that was a bad idea. Note to yourselves, next time you do public speaking, don't have a granola bar first. All right, so Short's father had died, like Jefferson's, when Short was young. So Short came and lived with the Jefferson family at Monticello, and then went to Paris with Jefferson. And in Paris, together, they became friends with several radical people, like, you recognize the guy on the left? That's Lafayette. Lafayette was one of the most radical French abolitionists, and he also was George Washington's conscience when it came to the issue of slavery. He kept on writing to Washington about how he needed to free his slaves. In 1783, right before Jefferson and Short showed up in Paris, Lafayette wrote to Washington with a daring idea. Here's what he said: "Let us unite in purchasing a small estate where we may try the experiment to free the Negroes and use them only as tenants. Such an example as yours might render it a general practice, and if we succeed in America, I will cheerfully devote a part of my time to render the method fashionable in the West Indies. If it be a wild scheme, I I had rather be mad that way than be thought wise on the other tack. Well, Washington apparently supported this idea in theory. Lafayette went back to France after he helped us out in the Revolution, and in June 1785, he purchased 70 enslaved African workers and a cinnamon and clove plantation. He called it La Belle Gabrielle. It was on the coast of French Guiana, which is north of Brazil in South America. Lafayette announced to Washington he was going to free those slaves, and then he was going to attempt to implement a system of tenant farming on the property. Working as tenants, the formerly enslaved people could learn the skills that they needed to govern their own lives, to make their own schedules, to develop the self-discipline that was necessary to succeed in a free labor market. Or at least that was Lafayette's theory. And if it worked, other slaveholders would maybe be convinced free tenants were more financially profitable than enslaved workers. Well, the summer that Lafayette began this emancipation experiment, 1785, Jefferson found himself discussing precisely the same issue while he was at a little party outside of Paris. These people that he was with were reformers, and they asked his opinion about whether adults who had been slaves their whole lives were capable of making the transition to being free men. And Jefferson wasn't sure. He remembered that back in Virginia, there were a few slaveholders who tried to give their enslaved people freedom, setting them up as tenant farmers, like sharecroppers. But they found, as Jefferson put it, quote, to give liberty to, or rather to abandon persons whose habits have been formed in slavery is like abandoning children. According to the rumors he had heard, the former slaves had difficulty adapting and getting all the skills they needed to be free laborers. Some became thieves, and they were re-enslaved. Still, in spite of these dismal rumors that Jefferson had heard, this lunch conversation in 1785 seems to have lit a fire under him. For the next several years, he and William Short spent a lot of time thinking about how to transition enslaved people out of bondage and into freedom using tenant farming as an educational tool. They were inspired by métayage, which is an ancient European form of sharecropping. In the system, landlords gave tenants tools and seeds, and in return, tenants would give a percentage, usually half, of their crop back to the landlord. Short and Jefferson decided that this kind of sharecropping would be the solution to America's slavery problem. By turning slaves into tenants, sharecroppers could theoretically give workers back their freedom, while at the same time the landholders would keep those agricultural workers they needed. Jefferson traveled a lot around Germany, and he discovered that people there were really good at being farmers. Combined with Short's research into métayage in France and Italy, Jefferson thought, aha, I have a plan. He described it in several letters. He said, number one, as soon as he made enough money off of his own plantations, he would pay his debts. Then he would take advantage of being debt-free by importing these hardworking agricultural workers from Germany to come and live on his farm at Monticello. He was going to divide his property into farms of 50 acres each, and he would settle equal numbers of Germans and slaves on these farms. The workers would all be placed, Jefferson said, quote, on the footing of the sharecroppers of Europe. Their children would grow up together in habits of property and foresight, as he put it, and he therefore had, quote, no doubt but that they will be good citizens. This is an amazing plan, because in it, Jefferson doesn't say anything at all about the need for racial separation after freedom. Jefferson and Short seem to have been imagining a multiracial future for America, and importing German workers to help slaves learn how to be free as tenant farmers seems to have been the first step in their plan. And Jefferson might even have put this plan into practice, except for two things. Right after he got back to America in 1789, he discovered George Washington wanted him to come and be the Secretary of State, and he had to leave behind his plans for farming. And second, Jefferson discovered he really sucked at money, and his financial situation did not get better. It just got worse and worse for the rest of his life. But while Jefferson's situation was getting worse financially, Short stayed in Europe, stayed as a diplomat, and Jefferson invested Short's money for him. Jefferson bought Short some land next door to Monticello. It's a property called Indian Camp. You can see it down at the bottom of this map here, and then Monticello is marked with a blue dot. He and Short began discussing renting this land, Indian Camp, out. Jefferson suggested renting it to white farmers, but Short wrote back, what he really cared about was using tenant farming to prove that black people were equal and to persuade white Virginians that they should free their slaves and then assimilate with them. In that remarkable letter from 1798 that I was talking about before, Short used his experiences in Europe to make a couple of important observations. First of all, Short realized that Jefferson was kind of permanently contaminated by prejudice. What he said was, white Americans who had grown up surrounded by slavery in the South were just incapable of seeing clearly when it came to issues of race. They tended to always focus on the negative ways the system of slavery had affected enslaved black people and their work ethic, rather than being open-minded about the positive changes that freedom could bring. As a product of this culture himself, Short consciously positioned himself as an outsider in his letter to Jefferson, recognizing that his time abroad, living in France and Spain, had given him a different perspective. Second, Spain had taught Short, if prejudiced Virginians' worst fears about the permanence of blackness came true, they freed their slaves, and the gradual influence of the climate didn't make those people turn white, then intermarriage would do that work instead. In a few generations, Short assured Jefferson, quote, all of our southern inhabitants will advance to the middle ground between their present color and the black. Southerners would, in a few generations, have a really nice tan, and they'd be like the Spaniards, who seemed to be doing pretty well despite their color. Well, Short was in a unique position to talk to Jefferson about beautiful mixed-race people because they were both familiar with the Hemmings family. The Hemmings family were enslaved people that were widely believed to be the relatives of Jefferson's dead wife, Martha. Martha's father had, it was said, fathered numerous children with his slave, Betty Hemmings, and the entire Hemmings clan came to live with Jefferson at Monticello when Jefferson married his wife, Martha. Years after Martha died, one of Betty's daughters, an enslaved young lady named Sally Hemmings, came to Paris to be a maid to Jefferson's daughters. Sally was described by those who knew her as, quote, mighty near white, very handsome, with long straight hair down her back. In 1802, Jefferson's political enemies started printing rumors that Jefferson and Sally Hemings had started an intimate relationship in Paris and that Jefferson was the father of at least one child with Sally. In 1873, many, many years after Jefferson and Sally were both dead, Sally's son, Madison Hemings, gave an interview in which he said at some point before they came back to America from Paris, Sally became pregnant with Jefferson's child. Madison Hemings later said his mother could have remained in France as a free woman if she had chosen to, because French law gave freedom to enslaved individuals who came within the borders of France itself. And that's true. However, according to Madison, instead of choosing to stay in France as a free person, Sally Hemings and Jefferson came to a mutual agreement. She returned with him to her family and friends in Virginia, assured that she would have a comfortable life and that her children would be freed when they reached adulthood. Now, if Jefferson and Sally Hemings did become involved in Paris and Short knew about it, he might have begun to think differently about the future of race relations in America. After all, if Thomas Jefferson could put aside what he said about race mixing being bad and act as though he believed that darker-skinned people were actually beautiful, desirable individuals, maybe other Virginians could come to view Black people as potential romantic partners too. But Short would never ever have mentioned a Jefferson-Hemings liaison in a letter because these letters were frequently opened at post offices and published in newspapers, and that would have been very controversial. So when Short wrote to Jefferson about racial intermarriage in the 1790s, he chose a different example. He brought up a well-respected woman named Frances Tucker, the wife of a College of William and Mary professor that they both knew. I haven't found any evidence that Mrs. Tucker was of mixed race, but apparently she had a darker complexion than most, and she was very pretty. Short argued she was, quote, the perfect mixture of the rose and the lily. And he concluded, there is no country that would not be content to have its women look like her. Well, before any Virginians would be comfortable with their children marrying people of the African race, they would first need to be persuaded that the races were equal. So Short once again suggested the best way to speed up the process of encouraging emancipation would be by showing how profitable and easy tenant farming would be. What Short didn't know was that Jefferson was already trying to change the way that he farmed. As we saw, when he was back in Europe, Jefferson decided that German workers were the best ones to work alongside the black slaves on his plantation. By the late 1790s, Jefferson began recruiting tenants from Maryland, which is where a lot of Germans had immigrated. In anticipation of their arrival, Jefferson set aside 480 acres of his land, broken up into different plots, and in a letter he explained, quote, "I find I am not fit to be a farmer with the kind of labor we have," meaning slaves, and implying he was ready to transition away from slavery to free labor using these German tenants. Unfortunately, right around this time, there was an economic depression in the North, and so nobody from Maryland wanted to move south. Jefferson kind of gave up, and then he got distracted when he became president. In fact, Jefferson didn't even reply to the more radical things that Short said in 1798. One explanation for why he stayed silent on this topic is when Jefferson received that particular letter about race mixing from his adopted son, William Short, Sally Hemings had just given birth to her oldest son, Beverly Hemings. Rumors about Beverly's paternity were already circulating in the neighborhood at Monticello. And if the father was Thomas Jefferson, it makes sense he would not want to confirm in writing that he supported racial mixing. This would quite possibly have derailed his chances of being elected president if it had been made public. Short had to keep asking, once a decade or so, whether Jefferson still believed that colonization of freed slaves was the best solution instead of trying to create a multiracial country. And eventually, a few weeks before he died, Jefferson wrote back he did believe colonization was still the best solution. As for Short, he retained his respect for Jefferson, despite the fact that Jefferson never followed through on that emancipation strategy they'd come up with. He eventually came back to America, never married, became a millionaire, settled down in Philadelphia. He never tried tenant farming either. He did try to encourage racial mixing in Philadelphia, but the abolitionists there told him that he was nuts. Not even Philadelphia was ready for something that radical. In fact, the quote was, "Deep-rooted prejudice among Philadelphia's white residents would prevent this from succeeding." The abolitionists in Philadelphia even said, Short, if you keep pushing for this, the more racist people in the city are going to push to hurt the free black population with more restrictive laws. So he gave up. He donated $10,000 to the American Colonization Society in his will. It seems that only while they were living in Europe were Jefferson and Short able to fully imagine a multiracial future for America. So let me turn now very briefly to my second topic. Why is our collective memory of Thomas Jefferson so important to us as Americans? Jefferson's always been controversial. As one of his earliest biographers said, quote, "It was the fate of Thomas Jefferson to be at once more loved and praised by his friends and more hated and reviled by his enemies than anyone else." In the election of 1800, John Adams' supporters said if Jefferson was elected president, the Bible would get burned in the street, babies would be murdered on pikes, there would be rampant immorality. Well, Jefferson won, and none of those things happened. And for a period of time, he and his party represented liberty and democracy. Then, in the years leading up to the Civil War, Jefferson started to represent totally different things to different people. Abolitionists used the Declaration of Independence and notes on the state of Virginia to support ending slavery. On the other hand, Confederate leaders, such as Alexander Stephens, rejected Jefferson completely, saying when Jefferson wrote, "All men are created equal," he was wrong. The Confederates had to totally repudiate Jefferson and his declaration because they were literally building a country on the cornerstone that all men are not created equal, and that in fact the white race was superior. Jefferson would never have supported that idea. He always held that slavery was wrong and that no man had the right to rule over another without his consent, even if they were of different races. After the war, Jefferson's policies came to be seen as too supportive of states' rights, and Hamilton biographies got more popular. This morning, my husband thought that I was putting on socks that had Alexander Hamilton's face on them. He couldn't see clearly. These are obviously Jefferson socks, by the way. I mean, and I would never be caught wearing Hamilton socks. I don't know what you were thinking. But by the Progressive Era, Jefferson's advocacy for the Western farmer and for democracy made him again popular with a wide range of figures like Woodrow Wilson. And FDR called Jefferson, quote, an apostle of freedom when he dedicated the Jefferson Memorial in 1943 in the middle of the Second World War. FDR kind of ignored all of the stuff that Jefferson said about having a small government. Then came the civil rights movement, and with it, a very much needed reckoning with the way white historians had ignored the voices of Black Americans when they wrote history. Black voices like that of Madison Hemings, Sally Hemings' son, who said Jefferson was his father. Many historians over the years had just rejected that story out of hand, like it was just unbelievable. But in the 1970s, people started talking about it again. And then in January 1998, the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke, and Bill Clinton came under fire for having an affair with a younger woman while in office. Clinton denied that he'd had an affair, but DNA evidence proved it happened. Well, later that year, a respected scientific publication called Nature magazine published an article about DNA testing with this headline, Jefferson fathered slave's last child. This headline is misleading. The DNA testing doesn't definitively show that Thomas Jefferson was the father of any of Hemings' children, though it does prove a Jefferson male fathered at least one of her children. But the tone of the conversation in 1998 was extremely polarized. For some people, this was good news. It showed that Jefferson and Hemings had a romantic love affair. Others said, well, this demonstrates presidents long before Bill Clinton had been engaging in extramarital affairs, so maybe Clinton's wasn't that big of a deal. For others, the headline was a travesty. It insulted the memory of a revered president. It accused him of doing something unthinkable. For others, the DNA evidence proved Jefferson was a rapist. Today, the Hemings controversy is probably just slightly less controversial than the fact that Jefferson owned slaves. And that's probably why there have been so many debates over whether there should be statues of Jefferson in public places or not. So why do we care so much? I think it's because Jefferson represents both the best and the worst about America. He wasn't perfect by any means. William Short would tell us Jefferson was a product of time and place, a prejudiced man who struggled to see how abolition would actually work. Jefferson could perhaps have done more, said more, tried harder to free more human beings, bought fewer books, drunk less wine, saved that money. Certainly, the nature of his relationship with Sally Hemings remains a troubling puzzle. And yet, he's one of the founders most responsible for the freedom that Americans enjoy to this day. A man who risked his life by writing and signing the Declaration of Independence when to do so was treason. A man who helped establish religious freedom, an advocate of democracy for the common man during a time when only the rich had power. And I believe the evidence shows that Jefferson was an opponent of slavery, who gave anti-slavery voices up to and including Abraham Lincoln the philosophical ammunition that they needed to end that institution. So how should immigrants to America like me feel about Jefferson? Sometimes I feel profoundly disappointed. I wish he had more explicitly come out on behalf of all aspects of racial equality. I wish he'd try harder to free his enslaved workers. Although the longer I study Virginian society and law, the more complicated that problem seems. I'm sad that a great revolutionary on behalf of freedom and equality should have a tarnished legacy. But I also know, without a shadow of a doubt, the reason why America has made so many strides toward liberty and equality for all is because America started out with a founding document that included the deceptively simple statement, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. It was so impossible for Americans to hold on to that statement and slavery at the same time that the Southern Confederate states had to reject Jefferson and break away and start their own nation, one founded on exactly the opposite principles, as the Vice President of the Confederacy said. South Africa was copying the Confederacy with its policy of apartheid, not the United States. And fortunately, for all the immigrants like me, the Confederacy lost and the United States remains, an imperfect nation, still pursuing the dream of liberty and equality for all. And also fortunately for immigrants like me, the United States motto remains, e pluribus unum, which means out of many, one. Whereas South Africa's government tried to hold on to power by dividing people into factions and fostering divisions between us, the United States, at its best, brings its people together. That is why the United States remains the country with the most immigrants in the world, and I'm honored to be one of them, teaching history to my fellow Americans.
Are you open to taking questions?
Yes, we are taking questions.
Okay, good. Can I ask the first question?
Sure.
You say something about this in your book, but I noticed it wasn't in your talk. On the cover is Jefferson's book notes on the state of Virginia. He had plans for educating the next generation of Americans in his anti-slavery views through the use of his book and the University of Virginia. Can you tell us something about those plans that Jefferson had for educating the next generation of Americans with his book?
Absolutely. Jefferson knew that he himself, while he was at college, had been particularly receptive to the ideas of enlightenment. That's where he learned about natural rights. That's where he came to believe that slavery was wrong. So he thought if students at the College of William and Mary could read a book that presented slavery as the opposite of a Republican freedom, that perhaps they would be persuaded enough to actually do something about it. So he wrote this book. He was really nervous that it would be controversial in Virginia. He was worried about the backlash, but he decided to send copies of the book and let the professors at the college just give copies of the book to the students that they thought would handle it the best. And eventually that's what happened. He sent something like 37 copies to the college. And there's several people who later on wrote and said, like Union General Winfield Scott said, while I was at college, I became persuaded that slavery was wrong because I read Jefferson's book. So it was an effective anti-slavery strategy. It wasn't enough to totally persuade enough Virginian men, but it did persuade some. Yeah. Hello. Yeah, I would have to resist arguing with them about the pedophile things. You'd have to get into the age of consent and how old was Sally Hemings and what's the evidence for that. I think that it's always important to start by acknowledging that slavery was wrong, that there is a problem when there is an enslaved person having a kind of sexual relationship with a master, that is a problem, that is not something that we should condone as a society. So I would start by agreeing with many of the same things that those people are protesting. But I think that I would also want to have a conversation about when we choose as a society who we're going to honor, what standard are we using to decide who we're going to honor? And are we certain that that standard is being uniformly applied to everybody? So for example, Martin Luther King cheated on his wife a whole bunch, and he plagiarized his dissertation. Should we have statues of him? Should we still honor him? What makes his offenses different? So I'm not saying that that's the same thing, but I think it's a good conversation to talk about the fact that none of our heroes are perfect, and that we need to be careful when we start taking down statues, that we're fair in how we do that we don't just target the people whose political sins seem the worst to us in the moment. Because as the last part of my talk kind of outlined, Jefferson has been hated for different things at different moments in time. So in a few years, there might be a different political controversy that people might think is more important. Are the good things that Jefferson said and did and contributed to the country worth us leaving him in place as an enduring testimony to future generations, despite the negative things that he did and is associated with? That's what I would ask. Thank you. So after he came back to America, Jefferson really stopped talking about this. And I believe the reason is twofold. Number one, it's because he was distracted by trying to win national office. And as I'm sure a lot of you know, if you're trying to win national office, you try to avoid pissing people off too much, or at least any more than what you have to. So Jefferson tried to avoid the most controversial topics. And unfortunately, by the time he was back in the national government, it was already becoming very politically dangerous to speak openly against slavery if you wanted any support from Southerners. So that's one reason. The other one is that his neighbors back in Virginia would have been getting increasingly closed-minded on this issue by the time he came back. The tide had already started to turn, and by 1806, Virginia was becoming increasingly pro-slavery. So we find much less from him. But we do find enough consistency in his statements, particularly privately. I don't think he changed his mind. And I also am persuaded because his children and grandchildren were all anti-slavery. And his grandson, in fact, in 1831, tried to pass an anti-slavery law in Virginia. And they actually had an open debate about slavery and argued about whether or not Thomas Jefferson really opposed slavery. And his grandson stood up and was like, no, you should read what my grandfather said. He was consistent on this. He wanted us to end it. They talked about it for a couple of days, and then they said, not right now, and then never talked about it again. The Civil War happened. So. Yes, please, Dr. Villado. Yeah, theoretically, Jefferson would have acknowledged the right of the enslaved people in Haiti to conduct that revolution. That was in line with what he would have believed to be just. However, Haiti was notoriously bloody and brutal and violent, first to the enslaved people and then to the white people left on the island. And there was so much fear, particularly among Jefferson's friends and relatives and fellow Southerners, that the ideas of Haiti could come over to the United States and start a similar uprising. That you kind of see a little bit of self-interest competing with this commitment to the right to revolution among natural rights. So yeah, that's a great point. Other questions? Do Jefferson's views on slavery and race come up in his letters to Adams? Yes, he sent his book to Adams, just like one of the very first copies, privately printed copies. And Adams wrote back and said, the passages on slavery are like diamonds. So there are a couple of moments that it came up in their correspondence, but Adams was really cautious about bringing up a touchy subject with his Southern friends. So it's not a frequent topic. And it's not something that we find, as far as I know, I haven't found this in their letters at the end of their lives where they reconcile. That was too touchy of a topic even for them to handle. Any others? Sure. Right. This is now Chatelain's argument. Right. was a way of breeding out blackness rather than embracing black people, I would say. That's a great question. My understanding of Short is that he was on the more radical side, that he would have embraced full assimilation, full rights of citizenship, full equality for black men and black women. But once he returned to America, he discovered that white Americans were far from ready for that sort of possibility, and that's why he runs into trouble with the abolitionists in Philadelphia, that they won't even support him calling for racial intermarriage between whites and blacks in Philadelphia. Yeah. No. He's not arguing for government intervention. He's arguing for the removal of government limitations on racial intermarriage. It was cool to find once I read through enough of that teeny tiny awful handwriting. So, is there more to your question, or is that it? No, that would have been really cool, but second best thing. So he had a multi-year affair with a French duchess. So the relationship started when she was like married to an older relative, and they got along okay, but it wasn't a love match, as most French aristocratic marriages were not. And she watched her husband get like torn to death by a mob during the revolution. And so Short was torn by his love for her. And then she was thrown in jail for years, and he was off being a diplomat in Spain, so he was heartbroken, and that's another reason why his letters are so annoying to read, because he was just whining all the time. Finally, she gets out of jail, and then he spends years living with her in the countryside in France, and then keeps trying to propose, and she keeps turning him down, and finally she marries another French rich relative. And that's when Short gives up and comes back to America and becomes a millionaire and dies in Philadelphia. So there's a whole section of his life that's like the tragic romance, and you can read their love letters. If you Google William Short and the Duchess de La Rochefoucauld, I think, they have beautiful love letters, but sucky ending to the story. Yeah. Cool question, thank you. Hi, Rick. I know Adams, I think, does talk about it years later, but I don't know that Jefferson does. What an interesting question. I might have to dig into that one a little bit more. You all know that like the Jefferson papers are word searchable. If you go to founders.archives.gov, you could maybe put in, I don't know what phrase I would search, but I bet there'd be a way to search all of his papers and see if he mentioned the Declaration and mentioned anything about how it was changed. I do know that he hated everything that Congress did. He thought his version was the best, and he would have liked to have kept it as it was originally. Oh, the Mariah Causeway. Yeah, so I would advise you to come to Zachary Scher's thesis defense in a few weeks, because he will be talking about that letter. It's a good question. I think the reason why the one is romanticized and the other is so controversial and, as you said, damned, is because of that inherent problem with can an enslaved woman consent? Or is the power dynamic so unequal that it's always going to be a little bit cringy? And the leading historian of Sally Hemings is an African-American law professor and history professor at Harvard. Her name is Annette Gordon-Reed. She literally wrote the book on this issue. She believes that it wasn't rape. She believes that based on what Sally's son Madison said about the relationship, and based on the fact that there were so many other Hemings family members living at Monticello, observing Jefferson for all of those years, that we would have noticed a lot more tension in the records if the family had been aware that Jefferson was raping Sally Hemings over and over. And because Jefferson seems to have had excellent relationships with all the members of that family, they had trusted positions, many of them could read and write, he would sometimes pay them for their work, they were the ones, many of them, who got freed in his will. The argument is that this indicates that if there was a relationship between Jefferson and Sally, it was consensual and mutual and long-term. But there's always going to be questions about that, just because she was not free to leave. She was not free to make her own decisions. And so you always have to have that little bit of an ick factor to deal with when you're talking about it, as opposed to the slightly different kind of ick factor of Jefferson having a love affair with a married woman. A platonic love affair, but still. It's a great question. So Jefferson's granddaughter wrote that there was a policy at Monticello that if an enslaved person looked like they were white, they were allowed to leave. And so there's records of that happening. One of them was Sally Hemings' daughter, Harriet. So if she was Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings, or another Jefferson male and Sally Hemings' daughter, she apparently looked so white that when she got to be close to 21 years old, I don't remember the exact age, the overseer took her down to the local station, put her in a little carriage, and sent her off to Philadelphia. So she was just allowed to leave, and she then passed into white society. We don't know what happened to her descendants. She married a white man. So she is one that was freed. Yeah, go for it. Yes. So she left, but wasn't legally freed. And there was a son who also was very white. He left and wasn't legally freed, but he would pass into white society. And then the remaining two children were legally freed in the will. So all of Sally Hemings' children were freed one way or another. Cara. Thank you. Yeah. Yes, by the end of his life, Jefferson was really depressed. Reading about the last decade or two of Jefferson's life is sad. His finances were not going well. His family wasn't doing well. His son-in-law had become an alcoholic. His favorite granddaughter was married to an abusive alcoholic. There were just lots of problems. And then to make things worse, Jefferson said he saw a turn in Virginia toward believing that slavery was morally okay. And that was the opposite of what he wanted. So yeah, there's several letters where he says things like, why did I try so hard during the Revolution if these younger people are just going to throw it away? College students at the College of Virginia, the University of Virginia, that Jefferson made his final project, were a bunch of jerks who would go around beating professors and throwing rocks through professors' windows. So he was disappointed by the young men there too. But I think that Jefferson still had hope that there would be younger men who would rise up to lead the anti-slavery charge. So if you ever read an 1814 letter to Edward Coles, it's another really famous letter, a lot of people read that letter and they say, Jefferson is just passing the buck. Edward Coles writes to him and says, Jefferson, won't you please lead the anti-slavery charge? And Jefferson writes back and says, no. And most people are like, well, there you go. Jefferson sucks. But if you read the letter carefully, what he's saying is, I'm old, I've done my best, my words are published, they're out there, people can still read what I think about this. You need to lead the anti-slavery charge. Don't give up hope. Look at what's just happened in England. And what he's talking about is William Wilberforce had just gotten it right to ban the slave trade in England. So there were signs that if you endured, you could make progress on the issue of slavery. And Jefferson hoped that younger men in Virginia would do that. Instead, Edward Coles, some of you might know the story, he just really wanted to not be contaminated by slavery. So he took his enslaved property, freed them, and moved to Illinois and became the governor of Illinois instead. And that left a void in Virginia, that there weren't young men arguing against slavery there. He really kind of paid a price for some of those people being so pure in their anti-slavery sentiments. It was difficult for people to figure out, to be statesmen, to figure out what was the prudent thing. Do you try to free all of your slaves, which means you have to leave the state in order to really do that well? Or do you stay in a state with slavery and try to change people's minds from the inside? That was tough. Well, I have been pushing for a Jefferson musical for quite a while, but I kind of don't think it's going to really fly at the moment. Yeah, you're right. Not a lot of people are going to volunteer to read the primary documents, and that would have been my first answer. If you're at all interested in this, you really have to read what he said. But I think what is happening that really makes me mad is that, yes, Jefferson was a slave owner, and as I've said, there's a lot to wrestle with. But why aren't we talking about how remarkable the Declaration of Independence was and how revolutionary in the history of the world that was to write that all men are created equal, or to advocate for religious liberty, or to advocate for poor men having the right to vote? I think it's tragic the way that we Americans currently now, we're so willing to bash the founders that disappoint us. And by the way, I think that it's a cheap way of excusing ourselves for the slavery and the injustices that are still happening right now. If we spend all of our time on college campuses being activists against the stuff that happened a long time ago or far away, and we don't talk about the stuff that we are complicit in, like the purchases of phones or clothing or different things that you and I make every day that are produced with slave labor, why are we not more concerned with that? Why are we so content to just vilify somebody from the past without really wrestling through what they were able to accomplish and what we can really learn, what lessons we can learn to apply to now? That's what I think. Totally George Washington. Easy answer, yes. I mean, come on. Argue with me if you dare. I respect him. I mean, I have the socks, but Washington frees his slaves. Yeah, and he does so, by the way, I think at the perfect moment, because if he had done that earlier, it would have been a lot harder for Americans to be united in their love for him, and we needed to be united in those early years. He did the best thing for his country, and he chose to put his country's needs above his own over and over again throughout his life. He absolutely, I think, embodies the ideals the best. All right, I think we probably have time for one more question. You want to ask the last question? No pressure. Hello. I had to travel really far, so. Oh my gosh. I have an opinion about this. I have theories, but I also, as a historian, think that I cannot answer that because circumstances have changed so much. He would be flabbergasted by the internet, that's for sure. Like, would his brain just explode with how much technology has changed? And when he was born, the fastest that any man had ever gone was the speed of the fastest horse. And by the time he died, steam engines were starting to become a thing, but now we've gone to the moon and we can communicate across the globe. So just the sheer amount of cultural and technological change, I think would be overwhelming. I don't want to, I think he would maybe be concerned about the size of government and other issues like that. We could maybe make some general claims from his papers, but other than that, I will refrain from answering that tempting question. All right.